am so excited for the year 2023. It will be the 100th anniversary of the conversion of Frederick C. Sadgwar to the Bahá'í faith. Or at least 1923 is when many people believe Frederick capped his eventful life with conversion to Bahá'ísm. Who, I hear you ask, is Frederick Sadgwar, and what is the Bahá'í faith? Well, those are both long stories, intriguing, but too often overlooked. Yet Frederick Sadgwar's background and history, and that of Bahá'ísm, seem to have met almost cosmically. Let's start with Frederick himself. He was a prominent businessman, notably in the carpentry and construction fields for decades in Wilmington, North Carolina. It is said that Frederick learned his trade from his father, David Elias Sadgwar, who remarkably enough was reputed to be the son of a young white lady and a French naval officer, but who was given up by his mother and raised by slaves from about 1817. Indeed, some say this illegitimate child, Frederick's father David, was considered a slave given this unusual arrangement. Note that I keep saying it is said that, or it seems, but that's the thing about history. There is so much lost in the midst of time. And of the things that are recalled, there are often different versions of what happened and why. Perhaps that's the reason Napoleon once called history myths we agree upon. Ironic, right? If anyone was obsessed with making a name for himself that would equal that of renowned emperors, it was Napoleon. But consider, why do we think so often of historically important figures in terms of those, especially men, who rose to prominence through violence, especially warfare on a massive scale? Sure, neuroscientists would say that the brain is wired to remember attention-grabbing events like violence and terror. But shouldn't somebody's mass violence preclude more than a mere mention of a person as an example of what not to do? After all, isn't it those millions who seek to build, to harmonize, and to respect fellow humans who do the best and most important work that anyone can do? Shouldn't such efforts be recognized and remembered? Certainly, Baha'u'llah, founder of the Baha'i faith, thought that those who had sought to enlighten mankind should be honored. And Baha'i recognized 9 such figures. And that's why the symbol of the Baha'ism is the 9-pointed star. The Baha'i say that God has sent multiple prophets, including Zoroaster, Abraham, Moses, Krishna, Jesus, and Muhammad, throughout human history to spread a message of peace and of the unity of mankind. The man considered the last of these prophets, and the founder of Baha'i faith, was known as Baha'u'llah. He lived in Persia, now called Iran, and launched this new religion there in the mid-1800s. As it happens, both Baha'u'llah and Frederick were from prominent families in their respective worlds. One, an aristocratic family in Persia, and the other, as a newspaper article in 1998 put it, was from one of Wilmington's last Black dynasties. And both the Baha'is and the Sadgwars would know trials and tribulations. So as the Bible indicates, nobody is a prophet in his own land. Sure enough, Baha'u'llah was persecuted by the Shah of Persia, repeatedly imprisoned and exiled. Some of his earliest followers were beheaded by the Shah, or otherwise executed after various tortures or humiliations. To Christians, the stories of cruel punishments inflicted on those who dare to preach a message of peace and love must sound familiar. And Frederick, like many in America, must have been exposed to Christian thought. Perhaps this helped pave the way for his eventual conversion. But so too, Frederick's heritage seems to have been of just the sort to illustrate a central tenet of the Baha'i faith. We are all one. and racism is but one obstacle to the realization of equality among all men and women. For as I was saying, Frederick's father, David Sadgwar, was probably entirely white, if I must use terms that the Baha'i faith holds must become obsolete. While Frederick's mother, Fanny Merrick, had an American Indian father. Yet in 1843, the year of Frederick's birth, slavery existed in North Carolina. So his parents could not officially marry, and he, Frederick, was born into slavery. When the 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery in December 1865, David and Fanny were free to marry, which they did, further unifying the growing family. Some educational opportunities also opened at the end of the terrible Civil War. So David Sadgwar took advantage of that too by sending his first sons to university. Frederick went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Another son attended Howard University in Washington, D.C. Education is, I might note, something else the Baha'i faith emphasizes, and their accent that the Sadgwar family put on learning no doubt contributed to their success and to their positive impact on the Wilmington community. It was in this altered American context at the end of the 19th century that Frederick Sadgwar was able to lead what, by many accounts, was a successful building business in Wilmington. He was also rather active in civic matters. For instance, he helped both to establish a school and to organize the United Charities, which sought to help the poor. Isn't that interesting? A man of mixed race being a successful entrepreneur and a well-respected member of the community in Wilmington during the last decades of 1800s America. Unfortunately, that situation did not last. And Frederick was put into a very difficult position during the Wilmington coup of 1898. One of the coup plotters' main targets was Alexander Manly, another man of blended heritage and a friend of the Sadgwars. He ran the Daily Record newspaper. During the coup, Frederick was summoned by the coup organizers to be part of a committee of leading colored men, again, to use a term that we might well leave behind, who were then pressured into issuing a statement distancing themselves from an editorial by Alexander Manly that was viewed by the coup leaders as provocative. Ultimately, the offices of the Daily Record were burned by rioters, and Alex Manly had to flee Wilmington, while Frederick Sadgwar survived the Wilmington coup and continued his business. Nevertheless, Frederick's role in public life was curtailed thereafter. But that's not the end of our history of the Sadgwar family, not at all. Remember my mentioning that in 1923, that seems to be the date that Frederick Sadgwar's conversion to the Baha'i faith? Well, that year seems to be derived from a single Wilmington newspaper article from 1989. Other sources indicate that Frederick may not have converted to the Baha'i faith until January 1925, just a few months before he died. Either way, behind the man, as so often is the case, lay the influence of a woman. Specifically, Frederick's youngest daughter, Felice Louise Sadgwar. Felice was born in 1892 in Wilmington and lived most of her life in a house near the corner of Market and North 8th Streets. When she passed away in 1988, she left the property to the Baha'i faith as a meeting house. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. As indicated, Felice came from a large and remarkable family. In addition to her father's record of success, for instance, one of her sisters, Carrie, became a renowned international singer, as well as the wife of Alex Manly, after he had been driven out of Wilmington and moved to Washington, D.C. True to the Sadgwar family's commitment to education, Felice attended the Gregory Normal Institute, established by the American Missionary Association from 1st to 12th grade. And despite the fact that the family did not have enough funds left by the time she, as the youngest child, might have gone to college, Felice nevertheless attended summer schools to attain credits that, in due course, enabled her to become a teacher in Wilmington. Indeed, during a career spanning some 40 years, Felice rose to become supervisor of music in all of the Negro schools, as they were then termed. Let's recall that when she worked for the Board of Education of Wilmington, schools were segregated. Later, even in what was supposed to be retirement, Felice was not one to be idle. She kept giving music lessons in her home, as well as serving in a local church as an organist, and for a time as director of the children's choir there. You might even say that Felice embodied the motto and logo of the city of Wilmington itself. Hardworking like these, and determined to, as the city still says, persevere. Moreover, her naturally compassionate nature never flattened. It was she who, after her siblings had left home and her parents aged, took care of her invalid brother. Felice noted in a 1978 interview that he was always cheerful and grieved less about his condition than she did. But she never ceased caring for him or for her students over the years. Indeed, her positive spirit must have been remarkable. Decades after Felice's teaching career, and indeed her death, a former student of hers, who still volunteers in the Wilmington Library, spoke in glowing terms about her and beamed with the sort of smile only those recalling a lovely experience or person will give. Yes, decades later. You could tell Felice touched the minds and hearts of the people she taught in her community. What more could any person wish to accomplish in life? But when did Felice become acquainted with the Bahá'í faith, and how? The Evertine Answers leads to another bit of often omitted history. Back in 1908, the then leader of the Bahá'í faith, known as Abdul-Baha, was finally let out of house imprisonment. This enabled Abdul-Baha to begin more actively spreading his message of the oneness of religions and of mankind. In 1912, having fortuitously chosen not to come to America on the Titanic, Abdul-Baha began a tour of North America, including New York, Montreal, and Los Angeles. And here is the amazing part. Abdul-Baha insisted that the meetings he addressed be open to all races. Remember, this 1912 was a time when segregation was not only legal, but the view that some races were superior to others was backed by many leading religious leaders, scientists, and of course, politicians. In short, during the early 20th century, just when scientific racism and later fascism were in vogue among many Europeans and Americans, a very different view of humans was quietly entering societies around the world. Yes, the Baha'is, in this proudly racist period, persisted in spreading their message. For instance, the Baha'i organization, they created a World Unity meeting in Chicago, at which topics such as racial amity were discussed before, quote, an audience almost evenly divided between white and colored, end quote, as the Baha'i newsletter of March 1927 put it. So in the United States specifically, men and women of varied and mixed races came across the teachings of the Baha'i faith in the early 1900s and converted to it. One of those men was named Louis Gregory. Yes, Gregory. Now, I don't believe that this Mr. Gregory was related to the Gregory after whom the Gregory Normal Institute was named, but again, what a coincidence that Felice went to a school with that name. Louis Gregory not only adopted the Baha'i faith in 1909, coincidentally the same year the NAACP was founded, he also became a member of the Baha'is National Committee on Racial Amity, set up in 1927 to address America's rampant racism. Yet, as the Baha'i newsletter of March 1927 noted, this would require perseverance, since, quote, The success of efforts by Baha'is to heal the spiritual sickness afflicting the body of humanity depends upon each worker purifying his own heart from all traces of racial prejudice. End quote. Over the years, Gregory made several trips to various states, including North Carolina, and to several nations, spreading the word of this new Baha'i faith, which remains illegal and persecuted in today's Islamic Republic of Iran, not to mention several other countries. It is probable that Louis Gregory met both Frederick and Felice Sadgwar at some point during his travels from the 19-teens to the 1930s. What is certain is that the Baha'i newsletter of April 1925 records that, in Wilmington, quote, "There lives a truly remarkable believer, a young woman who, for 7 years, has been devoted to the cause under most difficult circumstances. At present, her trials and sacrifices are bearing fruit, and Louis Gregory feels that in this city an assembly will soon be organized." End quote. If 7 is subtracted from 1925, that would put us in 1918. And Felice would have been only 26 years old, so a young woman. And let's not forget, 1918 was a year that saw some momentous events. It marked the end of World War I, a war in which millions were slaughtered in the name of national and imperial ambition. But it was also the year of the Spanish flu, a global pandemic that ultimately killed millions more. Could it be that Felice felt, in addition to the anti-racist appeal of the Baha'i faith's tenets, that her wounded world needed a fresh, more humane perspective? So was this persevering young lady in Wilmington to whom Louis Gregory referred Felice Sadgwar? We may never know for certain. But if Felice encountered and accepted the Baha'i faith around 1918, that would help explain the conversion of her father, Frederick, to the Baha'i faith in about 1923, and of her sister Mabel's conversion many years later. Certainly, decades later, Felice approvingly quoted Abdul-Baha by saying, "We look on all mankind as our brothers and sisters, and believe that the world should be in harmony," as several published accounts report. So it is not hard to imagine her holding on to Baha'i views for decades, given that Felice was the sort of person who persevered, working to obtain the credit she needed to teach, and then teaching and serving in the community for at least 50 years. And of course, we know she left her home to the Baha'i community to serve as a place for meetings and worship. Yet perhaps most importantly, in a taped interview late in her life, Felice Sadgwar persevered in urging all of us to not to dwell on the difficulties of the past, but to seek inspiration from those who persevered in putting mankind ahead of plan, and thereby to look forward to better days. Surely that's a bit of history and a perspective on history that shouldn't be omitted, should it?
Well, so I joined PCP to learn how to write plays and scripts generally, and this project came along, thanks to Kim, and she'll tell you more about that. And so we were sort of in effect commissioned to come up with monologues about historical characters, and I was invited to write something, and one of the names or possible topics mentioned was this family. And I started digging into it, and it's kind of like pulling on a little sweater. And then I discovered one thing and then another. So it wasn't just a question of, oh, here's Frederick Sadgwar, and oh, he survived the Wilmington coup. In itself, the whole interesting story. This was a big family with a lot of them. There were 12 children. So she had 11 other siblings. But I kind of had to focus on something. Yeah. And I was amazed to discover that there were these intellectual and theological currents going on that it even come into North Carolina. It's really 3 years ago. Yes.
Are there other descendants who are in the community today?
I wish I could tell you. My sense is that's possible, but a lot of the family moved on. So even her sister, well, one. So for example, her sister Mabel married Thomas Manley, who was actually the brother of Alex Manley, the man who was running the Daily Record who got run out of town. So, but when her husband, and they moved up to Philadelphia and/or New York, and so, but she came down to live with her sister a little later in life. My sense from my research, and I didn't focus on all these other 11 folks, is that most of them wound up moving on to Washington, Philadelphia, New York. Oh, yes. Okay.
How did the father manage to survive the coup when he was part of the committee of 25?
Yeah.
That the black committee that they wanted to take the message to,
Alex.
yeah, the whole community, but he didn't make it on time. How did that happen?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. That's one of the things about that. Like I was sort of. So the other thing about all this, if I may, is that you see how history and what we can remember and what we can find, it can be very challenging. So kind of to your point, I do find it interesting, and that's why I mentioned it, that Frederick came out relatively scot-free. Although, like I said, there was some evidence that his public life, his participation in public life was curtailed greatly after the coup. And that was probably most of the point of the thing, right? I don't know. I would speculate. I would say that he was an important business person at that time. He was in a line of business, a couple lines of business, right? Construction and so forth that are, that's necessary, right? He wasn't the one running a newspaper or putting in op-eds that were, creating or that were viewed as somehow, upsetting the apple cart, if you will, of the time. By the way, sorry, pun intended, I guess. And so I have a feeling that's part of it. He was already a relatively major member of the community at that time. So even though the coup wound up, cutting the legs out from under the participation of a number of people in the community, my sense is that he wasn't sort of, probably had the relationships, the business, and the non-political, generally non-political, he wasn't involved in politics or news. But I don't know. I didn't get a straight answer. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Don't we know? It's kind of like we don't really know when Felice encountered the Baha'i faith or how that worked. But it is interesting that this gentleman, Louis Gregory, was one of the early converts in America and was going around all kinds of states to try to spread the message. And of course, like I mentioned, it's still persecuted in Iran, where it started out. Right.
So is this the high faith still prevalent?
Well, I don't know if it's prevalent, but they're, according to online research, there are at least 8 million of them around the world. It's one of the fastest growing religions actually in the world, relative to most population growth rates, which doesn't mean a lot, but it's a global religion, but it's very, very quiet, probably because of this history, like most religions don't start out with some persecution. It's headquartered, one of its main headquarters is in Haifa, Israel. I mean, if you look online, it looks like a very beautiful structure. And the number 9 apparently is important. So they elect every 5 years a council of 9 people who decide and rewrite as necessary the canon and so forth.
How did you do this?
Very slowly. No, it's what's really cool is here at the library. I don't know if you all know this. There's actually a room upstairs, the North Carolina room,
Yes.
and it is chock full, if you want to really nerd out, of old maps and files and about all kinds of people, including actually Carrie, his sister, and so forth. And they're very, very nice. And that's actually where I met this lady who still volunteers at the library and once in a while. And I was telling her, oh yeah, I need this file, I need that file. She said, oh, she taught me music.
Oh.
I'm like, what? Then she started babbling happily about this lady that long ago passed away. And that kind of impressed me. And so,
Yeah.
I thought that's an interesting way of trying to measure historical importance, right?
Yes. Yes, we've been there to research our house. They're just wonderful people.
Yeah.
Very dedicated.
Yeah, they are. Well, thanks for the opportunity.